Hey, folks, on today's Rebel's Edge, big dollar bets on the greenback continue as we head into this election eve today, November the 4th. Yum Brands China serves up some delicious numbers, but does it say a lot about the Chinese economy, or is this a late COVID bloomer? And finally, big nuclear gets rocked as Constellation Energy loses ground on regulatory concerns. Does that mean that the setup for small modular reactors is even better? We'll cover all that and more on today's Rebel's Edge.
Bang. It's not an option, Mark, to just trade stocks. And we're going to be talking a little bit about the VIX. Moving through 23 today. That's right, folks. It's not an option to just own stocks. If you own them and you're playing into the election, you're probably a little nervous because the markets are uncertain. Well, let's dive in. Marc LoPresti right there, not Pete Najarian on the Rebel's Edge. Pete is over in Paris and down in Saint-Emilion. Checking out the great wines, I guess, Mark. So
I'm sure you can give some tips, John. I mean, if anybody knows the wine region in France and in Napa, it's you.
Maybe.
But yeah, kudos to Pete and hope that he enjoys a much needed and well-deserved break over there in Europe.
Yeah, I think he and his wife, Lisa, will definitely have a good time. They bought it at a charity auction, Mark, for the Naples Wine Festival in Naples, Florida. And so they're over there with a group of folks getting great tours, having a fabulous time. And it benefited some of the people who really need it around Naples, because that's a pretty expensive housing market. And I imagine after the storms, it's probably even rougher on some of the folks. But luckily, a lot of very generous people bought nice things, and they're getting to enjoy them and get a partial write-off, maybe not a complete write-off. But I'm not your tax man. I'm your trade man. Let's talk, Mark, about what's going on with Macro Minute. And I'm going to dive into what you said about global hedge funds making big bets going into the U.S. election. Apparently, Europe believes that Trump is going to be reelected. And for that reason, as Mark said, we're seeing a lot of trades that many of us would call Trump trades. Strong dollar, that would be one for sure. And they just continue to hit day after day for basically the last 60 days, Mark.
Yeah, that's right. And this is sort of a macro minute fantastic futures combo we're doing here, because same topic, but from two different angles. And yes, as John points out, the big bets on the Trump trades continue to pile up, notwithstanding this morning's pretty significant market volatility and sell-off, the VIX hitting a 23 and change handle just before we went live. But yeah, I mean, the two things that stand out to me, John, one is the levered nature of these big money bets. And of course, by big money, we're talking about the hedge funds, global hedge funds, not just in the United States, but managers that manage large pools of private money around the world are making these large leveraged bets. And what are they betting on? They're betting bullishly on the greenback, as I teased in the cold open, and they're betting very bearishly on basically everything else, particularly the yuan, big shock, the peso, big shock, but even the euro. Those are all bets that Trump's going to come in. He's going to win. He's going to go heavy on the tariffs as he's promised, and it's going to shake up those other economies and those related currencies. Not saying that they're right, but you know, folks, we like to report on where the smart money's headed, and that's where the smart money's headed right now. And this is according to folks, this isn't our opinion, folks. This is according to the prime desk at Goldman Sachs. This is according to data from the CFTC. So pretty hard to disagree.
Yep. Very hard, in fact, to disagree. Let's talk for a second, Mark, about two big things that went on. One, you've already mentioned the VIX, which has moved up through 23. There's a big bet that's been placed right after that big move, Mark, and that big bet is to the downside. It is that after the election, the volatility contracts significantly. it goes down into the low teens, perhaps.
Holy cow.
Because somebody just bought 92,000 of the November 20th expiring 15 strike VIX puts. So since Pete's not here to cover the VIX, I'm going to cover the VIX, and that's one. And I know you've got something to say about OPEC, Mark, and the crude oil contract that's moving up pretty big today.
Yeah, I mean, listen, what's really interesting about that massive, unusual paper that we had in the VIX, that's a bet on certainty, right? Versus uncertainty. The big concern and part of why we're seeing the sell-off that we're seeing this morning, I think, John, certainly from the traders that I've spoken to, is there's concern that we may not know, notwithstanding how tomorrow goes and tomorrow night, that we may not know a clear winner and that there may be some lawfare and other things that are engaged in thereafter. That's uncertainty. Markets and traders hate uncertainty, and that's often reflected very accurately and acutely in the VIX. So that is saying something. That is a massive trade, a massive bet, 92,000 contracts. That's remarkable in size, and that's a bet on certainty by the 15th, which is less than 2 weeks away. Let's hope they're right. We certainly don't want uncertainty in markets being roiled and money being lost. So let's see what happens there. And then, yes, John, on the oil front, OPEC announcing that they're going to agree to a 1-week delay in a planned production output increase that would extend production cuts of 2.2 million barrels per day through December. I think that's through the beginning of December. That putting some impact, obviously, on the movement of oil, which by and large has been somewhat range-bound for the past couple of weeks.
Yep. Well, back through 71, Mark, so we'll keep an eye on that.
Still cheap.
The higher it goes, the more inflation technically that we get.
Yeah.
Because something's got to be shipped, something's got to be flown, something's got to be delivered that last mile, and virtually all of that is either Jet A, diesel, or gasoline, which is all, of course, derivatives of crude oil. All right. Mark, let's dive into ATSG, Air Transport Services Group. This is something that Mark and I know more than probably 99% of Wall Street, Mark, because Mark was negotiating a deal with a company in South Florida at Opa-locka Airport that has one of the largest MROs, are they called, Mark?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
A maintenance and repair operation at Opa-locka Airport. And these guys don't just do that. They don't just repair planes, but they repair them, they gut them, they turn them into cargo models. So if you have a 767, and obviously there's huge demand from Amazon and others for exactly, basically cargo jets. Well, these guys, ATSG, they do that, and Stonepeak, Mark, stepping in with a $3 billion bid to take the company private.
Yeah, I mean, listen, that PAX to cargo, as it's called in the industry, is a pretty good business. These planes are picked up fairly cheaply. They're retired passenger planes. They are, as John said, gutted, reconfigured their interior-wise to slide those pallets around. And maybe there's some upgrades to the avionics depending on the age of the plane. But there are, even with conservative forecasts for global economic growth, which, of course, based on the outcome of this election, could become potentially even more accelerated, there is just not enough of these new cargo planes, particularly the 787 cargo, that to meet the demand. These planes are also typically 1/10 or less the cost of a new one. And there's only so many people in the country that can do this. You need a special STC, special certificate from the FAA to let your MRO do this kind of work. Obviously, as you can imagine, they don't want people in their garage converting planes and flying them around, and then people's Sephora packages come, flying down into the backyard. Would not be a good outcome. And this is an interesting move on Stonepeak's part. It's a take private. I don't know if there's much that you can glean from whether or not they're concerned about what it might be as a public company under a Harris administration. Lots to unpack here. I think they paid up, but paid well for this. And certainly it's a space that we continue to look at carefully in terms of that demand for cargo airplanes that is just not going to be met by the availability of new models.
Yeah, and with the problems Boeing's had, Mark, you could just magnify that.
That's right.
Because their new 777s that are supposed to be delivered, and they're already 1 year or more late with that, are going to be another year into the future. So you can't retire a passenger 767 until you can get the new one. And then, of course, turn that old one into cargo potentially. Well, anyway, let's talk about Constellation Energy. This is a sector that Mark and I have talked about a lot because of the demand that is put on basically electricity providers in a world where we need more power for data centers, we need more power for EVs and the like. Well, turns out there's a lot of problems, even though they had great numbers, and this firm had great numbers, but nuclear stocks across the board today are getting hit because they fear that perhaps there's going to be more regulation coming down because nukes have just been jumping up so much, and the cost of not just the uranium, Mark, but the cost of getting these plants back online is perhaps somewhat prohibitive. So Constellation trades down hard. And you know what, folks? Yes, we had unusual activity with the stock north of $260 a share. There it is. On the 18th of October, stock basically just shy of 270. They're buying the November 8th, that's this Friday, expiring 250 puts. Well, they paid $10 for a put that now is worth some $35.
Nice.
So that is a nice windfall for all of our subscribers. And if you're not one yet, folks, you should be one.
Yeah, I'd love to see that. Kudos to everybody. Take profits, of course, especially heading into increased vol, which we already covered. But I think, there's a little bit of a misnomer in the Chiron there, nuclear slips. Constellation, don't forget, is the company that agreed and announced the restart of 3 Mile Island. Okay, it's one of the largest reactors in the United States, one of the largest nuclear plants in the United States. And it's not terribly surprising that there's going to be some regulatory concern, maybe some regulatory headwind against, and certainly maybe even public concern and headwind when it comes to turning on a facility of that size. The question really is, John, what does this mean for the nuclear space in general? And I'm not prepared, as I teased in the cold open, to say that, we're going to see continued problems for nuclear, broadly speaking. I think this actually sets the cards up very nicely for our friends that are in the SMR space, the small modular reactor space. The footprint is a fraction of a 3 Mile Island. The amount of uranium involved is a small fraction of what a large plant like that is. Will there be regulatory review of those SMRs? There will be, but I think that's a big part of why that space has been as hot as it is, because there's no comparison to saying I'm going to have a small modular reactor that fits in the size of a metric shipping container on the back of a semi somewhere and flipping the switch to turn 3 Mile Island back on. Huge difference in safety, huge difference, I think, even in regulatory concern there. So we'll see. And look, they're beating up CEG pretty heavily. And based on what happens tomorrow, you could see a rebound, because I think you'll see, if there is a Trump administration, I think you would see more willingness to go in to things like nuclear as well as into drilling. But John, you got a yummy trade to talk about next.
I've got a yummy trade, and it would be Yum China. And Yum China, folks, moving up substantially. Revenue up 5% year over year to just over $3 billion. And get this, same store sales numbers up 97%. And some of you are going to think that I'm misspeaking when I say 97%. How is that possible, John? Well, China, as you guys may recall, stayed locked down far after the rest of the world with their response to the COVID virus. COVID. And so the pandemic itself was bad. China has not been able to restart itself in a big way. And this is one area where apparently the Chinese were hungry, if you will, Mark, for KFC. They were hungry for Taco Bell. They were hungry for Pizza Hut, and even Lavazza, the coffee place. These are all the brands that Yum China, which separated from Yum in the US, those are all brands that are part of Yum China.
Yeah, no doubt. And listen, before people get too excited about this and say, well, maybe the Chinese economy is not as bad as it is, and maybe there is strength and the opportunity to make some money in some of these Chinese names, not so fast, because as Jon points out, I think this was largely that very delayed emergence from COVID. They kept their lockdowns going way longer than anybody else, as we well know. There was social unrest in response to that, and understandably so. So listen, I would take profits on this one. I would not try to chase this one, and I would not expect Yum to deliver another delicious quarter next year.
Yeah, I think it might be more of a snack next year than a full-on meal, Mark.
That's right.
All right, let's dive into TGTX, which is TG Therapeutics. These guys, we've covered them a lot on this show because they've had spectacular performance. Well, today it's only spectacular if you're a bear, because TGTX, it's reversing this big breakout that they had and moving to the downside after missing Q3 profit expectations. So this is one that you might want to look for an entry point at some lower levels if you're an options trader. Could you even consider selling some puts on a big downward move like this? Sure. Just understand the risks that are inherent with selling a put means you're obligating yourself to buy stock at a lower price. But that's one of the benefits, I think, of people that do trade options, Mark. You say, hey, this thing's still too high, I'd like to buy it lower. Well, you could sell a put at that lower strike. You keep the premium if it doesn't get there. And if it does, you're buying it at a much lower price.
Yeah, that's right. That's why we do what we do. And look, a lot of this is going to come down, and it's interesting because they did try to set some rather positive expectations, particularly as it relates to the expected ongoing sales of their multiple sclerosis drug, Briumvi, which did $83 million for the year. That was above expectations, but they're talking about maybe doing up to $300 to $305 million of that drug next year. Which would be great, but it seems like traders ain't necessarily buying it. It's one of the reasons I don't love some of these pharma biotech stocks, Jon. People have heard me say on the show before, they tend to be so binary in their outcome. Even with an existing drug, this obviously was not a phase 2, phase 3, or a phase 3 approval story. This was the same sales story. And of course, one that is going to be particular, a sector, as we covered on Thursday, that is going to be impacted particularly strongly by the outcome of this upcoming election, which I think is happening tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. All right. Well, Mark, we do not have our friend Pete, my brother, your friend, but we do have Pete's Red Zone Sports that we're going to dive into right now. And it's good news for Fox that the Dodgers and the Yankees were so popular, despite the fact that the Dodgers went up basically 3-0, and the Yankees did get an extension because the Yankees came back with just a tremendous onslaught of hits and runs and beat them in Game 4, but then didn't have enough left in the tank and apparently made too many mistakes in Game 5 and lost 4-1. However, the Dodgers, these numbers, Mark, that they did for the World Series this year, this was one of the best that we've seen in the last several years. And not surprising. I mean, Mark, you live in New York or, the surrounding area. To have the two, and you've lived in LA, so
That's right.
To have the two coasts with the two biggest population centers vying for a World Series, that is a recipe for great ratings, and that's what they got.
Yeah, they certainly delivered, and they are very serious about their Dodgers in LA. I can tell you, I used to have season tickets, or at least the entity that I worked with used to have some terrific season tickets, and I loved going to those games. It's a totally different thing when it comes to baseball on the West Coast. I don't know why they had to try to burn the city down afterwards, but that's a whole other conversation.
Yep. It unfortunately, many parts of the country, they do that. And it's not just a blue state, red state. It is, rather than just celebrating, people use the cover of all those people in the streets, occupying police perhaps or whatever, that they're able to get away with some of this kind of stuff, which is a real shame, because I'm sure none of the real sports fans are the ones doing this. It's probably a very, very small cadre of folks doing that.
So
all right. How about this one, Mark? The Vikings. So Pete loves his Minnesota Vikings. Although he's a reasonable or a measured person on it, he knew they had lost 2 in a row. So could they snap that losing streak? And now we know the answer is yes, because Sam Darnold, who was a number 1 draft pick of the Jets way back when and just flamed out with them, has been rejuvenated and done a fantastic job for the Minnesota Vikings, who we thought they would probably have a rookie quarterback from Michigan helming the Minnesota Vikings this year. Not to be. Instead, Sam Darnold is just putting up unbelievable numbers. And even when he makes mistakes, Mark, which he made in this game, they were able to come back in the second half with a big defensive stand as well as offense that put them over the top.
Yeah, that's right. And that was fantastic, John. I've got my own Pete's Red Zone Sports thing to talk about today, which is it seemed like, and you know where I get most of my information from, John, but it seemed like this was not a good weekend for injuries. No. Dak Prescott getting taken out, leaving the Cowboys in a bit of a shambles. CeeDee Lamb, one of our favorites, also on the sidelines with a shoulder injury. What is the deal? It seems like we talk about this month after month and maybe even year after year. But, and it's funny because the last time the 3 of us were together last week in New York, we got into a bit of a discussion about this with your brother Pete, that maybe this has to do with, how the training is done nowadays and padding versus no padding and whether or not these guys are really used to the kind of impacting things that happen during real gameplay. But it seems to me that the injury list, and with some pretty critical people, I mean, I'm hearing people are very concerned about the Cowboys' prospects for the rest of the season. But I'm really curious to hear your opinion. What is leading to what seems to be an ever-growing list of injuries, especially quarterback injuries?
Yeah, well, quarterback, it's just that the quarterbacks have virtually no protection. Right. They have the referees for protection, but the amount of padding and so forth that they carry is very slim. And there's an awful lot of running that quarterbacks have to do because of the speed of these defensive ends. Now, is that lack of practice? Perhaps, but I think more of the injuries that I would blame on practice, Mark, are the tackling of people, whether they're being tackled or whether the tackler is perhaps the one that's hurting himself by getting a shoulder, by getting a knee, by getting a hamstring. And like you said, Dak Prescott, Dak Prescott, that was a hamstring. I'm sure he stretches a lot. I've watched him move up and down from the 50-yard line to the goal line, just, twisting back and forth when he's doing his pregame warm-ups and things. But nonetheless, you're going to get injuries. This is a violent sport. And I think most of it that the quarterbacks get is just, wrong place, wrong time. Something happened and, the quarterback throws and hits his thumb on a helmet and breaks his thumb or sprains his thumb or whatever it might be. But the running back injuries, the linebacker injuries, the lineman injuries, those are different. And I think those are the ones that could be mitigated with a little more practice. But the NFLPA, National Football League Players Association, they have negotiated very few. I think it's 20 in the whole season with pads. And that's probably not enough, but I don't think that's going to get changed anytime soon, Mark.
Yeah.
But you're right. A lot of injuries and a lot of big name players still getting those injuries. And Dak Prescott, he's one of them that just might be out for a couple weeks here.
It seems that way, and wreaking havoc with people's fantasy football standings. So that's
God forbid.
God forbid. But Jon, what do we have to remind? This is, of course, that part of the show where we do a little shameless promotion. What do we have to remind our adoring fans of? I mean, obviously, we got the Rebel Mastermind coming up less than 2 weeks in Miami. VIPs are sold out. We got a few executive tickets left. We were concerned that General Tata was not going to be able to make it. He is actually going to be there. A fantastic lineup. So as I say all the time, folks, if you are in the area and you'd like to come trade with us live on the 19th of November, scan that QR code, call that 888-800 number, grab one of the few remaining tickets left. You will not be disappointed.
No, you will not be. It'll be great. We will have a number of exciting guests that we haven't announced either. And this is, of course, the event that was supposed to occur in October when, unfortunately, Hurricanes Helene and Milton made that an impossibility. From a safety standpoint, it just wouldn't have made sense. And we didn't want a bunch of our great fans, our great potential subscribers and so forth, to be stuck at airports around the country, not able to get into Miami area. So this is that follow-up. And then we'll have some new stuff to announce in the very near future for a Vegas event as well, Mark. So
that's right.
Bang. All right, folks, thanks very much for tuning in. Mark and I will be back again tomorrow, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. I hope you have a great afternoon, and we'll see you tomorrow at 1.